I'm Josh Lubin-Levy, and I am a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow here at the Whitney Museum of American Art, which is where we're broadcasting from. Thanks for joining us for this course inside the Whitney Biennial. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, we'll be looking at this year, the 2022 Biennial, going through almost all of the artists, all 63 artists and artist collectives that are featured in the show on the museum's 5th and 6th floor. If you've been to a course before online, welcome back. If not, the way these work is I have about 45 minutes of material to share with you. And after that, I'll reserve some time for about 15 minutes of question and answer. But you should feel free to ask questions at any time while I'm speaking. And the best way to do that is to use the Q&A button that's in the Zoom chat bar. And so you can do that at any point. So just to get us started, I thought I should, of course, mention that this year's biennial was curated by David Breslin and Adrian Edwards. It was meant to open a year prior, but of course was delayed a year by COVID. So it's almost a triennial, some people have referred to it. And it's a biennial that I would say looks back at the long legacy of what the Whitney's biennials have been, going back to the first biennial in 1932, which was then changed in 1937 into an annual. And during this period, they were happening at the Whitney Studio Club in the Greenwich Village area, and were very rigidly focused around the last 2 years of painting or sculpture. In 1973, the museum moved to doing biennials and opening up the media to photography and video and performance and film. And it's in that moment that the Whitney Biennial really became a biennial of what's happening in contemporary American art. I would say that since then, we've put all of those terms under duress. What does it mean to be an American artist or a museum of American art? But also, what does contemporary art mean in a global context, but also in very specific and local environments? And one of the things that this year's biennial artists or curators have done really beautifully, I think, is push against the idea that a biennial is about telling us where art is going in the future. Many of the artists featured in the show actually look backwards to find a way forward. So there's a lot of retrospection in this year's exhibition. This year, the biennial curators have chosen to have a subtitle, which some curators do, some don't. The subtitle of this biennial is "Quiet as It's Kept." And this is a phrase that has many meanings. It's a colloquialism, mostly from Black Southern culture, that refers to ideas of secrecy or intimacy. One way to think about it is saying something like "just between us, quiet as it's kept." Many of you might actually know this phrase more familiarly from the writings of Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison uses "quiet as it's kept" often, and famously in the introduction, the very first lines of her book, The Bluest Eyes, which reads, "Quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. We thought at the time that it was because Peccola was having her father's baby that the marigolds did not grow. A little examination and much less melancholy would have proved to us that our seeds were not the only ones that didn't sprout." So what Morrison is referring to in terms of a secret is a really traumatic, violent secret, a history of sexual violence and incest. But also this idea that's so deftly in Morrison's writing, in less than 2 sentences, this idea of a secret that is kept in shame, a sense of punishment. The marigolds aren't growing because of this thing that's hiding. It turns into something that looks outward, realizing that the marigolds aren't growing for anyone, but still thinking about what that secret is doing in this landscape. That might be one reference for this subtitle. Another, more familiar to the history of American visual arts, is a show that was curated by the artist David Hammons in 2002, featuring 3 Black American artists who all work in abstraction. For that show, Hammons called the show "Quiet as It's Kept." And it was really meant to be an exhibition that pushed back against the ideas of what conventional quote unquote Black art looks like. That here are 3 abstract artists all working against the idea that in order for their work to have a dialogue with race, and particularly around Black radical culture, that it needs to be representational. So in this case, Hammons talked about the idea of quiet as it's kept being something about the idea that these artists have explored a hitherto little examined potential in abstraction as an outgrowth of the meaning of Blackness. The other thing that the curators of the show have done is include a symbol. And I'll return to the symbol a bit in more depth later on, but just to flag that the symbol is this open-ended parentheses, and it comes from this concrete poet, N.H. Pritchard. You can see the poem that it comes from on the right here. These open-ended parentheses look out, they have this expansive view, and that open-endedness, not seeking to enclose meaning, but to kind of frame things in a way that expands the ways that we build meaning around them, is very much endemic to, I think, a lot of the artists in the show. What Pritchard's poem is doing in particular is using this open-ended parentheses around the idea of deconstructing that language is only based on its meaning, that words mean something in the way we put them together in sentences. What Pritchard's poem is doing is spatializing language. It's as important as what the word looks like and where it appears on the page as it is the sequence of the letters as we read them here. And I'll come back to this idea about the open-ended parentheses in the last section of our course. Now, the curators of the biennial, in that open-ended spirit, have refused to incorporate themes in the show. If you've actually seen the exhibition, you'll know that there are no galleries with certain themes or subsets. What they have instead, they're calling hunches. And they take this idea from the art historian So-Young Yoon, who writes for the catalog, and talks about the imperative clarity of a hunch, which I think for Yoon really means something like that guttural feeling that gives you such clarity and is almost more clear than when you try to define the affect or the sentiment or feeling. In fact, what Adrian Edwards and David Breslin have done is curate groupings of artists around ideas or concepts they've been working on as curators for a long time, things they're attached to, ideas, artists they're attached to, and they include a revision of conceptualism around its lushness, the idea of autoethnography as a method, so taking the self as a way of looking out at the world, but even things like Sinister Pop, which was actually a show that happened at the Whitney in 2013 and was about the dark side of pop art, the kind of the rampant excess of consumer culture. Because they don't have any themes, one thing that has really grounded how the work has been installed is that the 5th floor and the 6th floor are almost like mirror images of one another. They're almost like two sides of a coin. But they take almost a kind of radical shift in the way they spatialize the art. On the 5th floor, it's all white walls with these structures that leave an open expanse in the gallery. It's totally open-ended. It's cacophonous. You can hear the videos playing from one end while you're looking at a sculpture on another. You can see that the structures that have been built to hold works have all these ways of looking through them. And the whole point is to be able to look at different artists in relationship to one another. And the curators have called this floor airy, light, kind of hopeful. Whereas on the 6th floor, right above it, is a room filled with black walls, all enclosed with a black carpet. There's a lot of media, as you can imagine, in the black box of this floor, but it's also a space the curators have described as one of confinement, containment, arrest, a kind of closing down. So that sense of black and white, open and airy, closed and contained gets switched around when you start to look at the art that's in these spaces, where sometimes it's the most sort of caustic, aggressive work that you find in the white space and the most intimate, subtle, kind of needing a kind of one-on-one relation that you find in the black galleries of the 6th floor. So there really is this play with how these different spaces allow for different experiences for the viewer in relationship to different art. Some artists are actually featured on both floors. So you get to like have the experience of their art in these very different environments. Now, because of all of this, I should say that it makes it very hard to teach a course on the biennial, because the idea is that you could really put any of these artists in relationship to any of the other works in the show, that you could see them on the 6th floor or the 5th floor, that you could imagine that the environment would shift their meaning in different ways. So I've come up with my own themes for how to structure the 3 days that we'll spend together. But I encourage you, as you look at these works, to think about your own kind of through lines that you find connecting the pieces, as that's very much part of what the curators are interested in. But what I'll look at, and this will be the sequence of the 3 sessions, is first this idea of abstraction, which features really strongly in the show. And it's not only about abstract art, abstract painting, but thinking about the process of abstracting something, whether it's pulling something apart or piecing enigmatic things together, trying to get a sense of or a hold of something that's hard to define. Figuration and the 1993 biennial, which really centered questions of identity, is a big resonance in the show of 2022. But figuration not only is about giving the figure, the body, but trying to give form and shape to things that are hard to define. And then lastly, this idea of retrospection, really this idea of looking back. And Candace Hopkins, who's a scholar and writer and curator and artist, has an essay in the book that I think beautifully spells this out as artists who are attending to the echo beyond the amplification. What comes in the wake of all the kind of rush of urgency for an artist to address something? How do you stay in the trouble, to use another kind of invocation there? But to stick with abstraction, this is where we'll jump in today. And abstraction can mean a number of things, but certainly one of the things that abstract art conjures for viewers is the idea of playing with color, line and shape and form, the ways in which an image is constructed. So I'll use those as sort of organizing principles, but you can see how expansive the artists in the biennial take these very simple aesthetic terms. Renee Green's space poem number 7, Color Without Objects, Interactive May Words, is a work that will greet you as soon as you enter the lobby of the Whitney Museum. And what Renee Green has done here, and she's done this with a number of space poems, is actually take found text, sampled text, whether it's poetry or critical writing or simply fragments and phrases that come from everyday life, and put them on these colored banners, hanging them from the ceiling so that they draw the viewer's eye upward and actually immerse the viewer in this kind of spatialized language. It's part of Renee Green's well-known practice of using citation as a method to bring her own work in dialogue with others' works. And we'll find this recurs throughout the other installations that Green has in the biennial. Here, Mae Swenson, who's the poet that Renee Green is drawing from, is a poet from the 1960s, a lesbian poet, really famous for her very playful ways of taking something as simple as color and inverting the ways in which we think we understand this concept. Swenson's poem, Color Without Objects, was printed in the New Yorker in 1965, and it really is a poem that tries to think about colors on their own terms, rather than color as a description of an object. How do we think of color as a thing into itself? So she starts color without objects, colors alone, wriggle in the tray of my eye, incubated under the great flat lamp of the sun. And she goes on to talk about a variety of colors, trying to conjure the sense of that color itself. I think about, when I read this poem, I think about closing my eyes and seeing colors and trying to write about the colors I see when vision isn't the way I'm accessing the color necessarily, but there's some kind of play of color that emerges and disappears throughout the course of this poem. And so it's really a way of talking explicitly about color, but expanding how we use this idea of color as a descriptive term. What's interesting about Swenson's poem, which you can see written out in black text here, is that has a certain cadence. It's these two line stanzas. What Renee Green has done is totally deconstruct that poem. So the poem plays out in the space in sequence. You could read these panels one after the other and you'd read the full poem, but you can also read Color Without Objects, Sharp Green Squints I Have Never Seen, which is right behind it. And it's like you're making up your own poem. So you're pulling it apart and piecing it together in your own way. It's text that you can never read all at once. The body has to move through the space in order to comprehend the poem. So it's really breaking open this idea of color in a new way. And it's both meaningful in the way it immerses you in making your own meaning out of the work, but it's also meaningless or misreadings of the poem, because what Renee Green has done is inject color back into a poem that's about colors not being about objects. So we're actually seeing this orange background with blue text and a blue outline. And then the text says color without objects, colors alone, but it's not colors alone, it's colors in a banner here. So there's this push and pull of how art can and can't inhabit this idea that's inside of Mae Swenson's poem. And certainly one of the things for Renee Green in this work is thinking about the idea of color. It's many resonances as an artist of color, as a Black artist. And we'll see that resonate throughout a number of Green's works as we return to her practice in the third session of this course. But what's also on view in the first floor in the lobby of the museum is another work by the artist Tony Coates that also uses text and color to play with how we make meaning. Tony Coates' series, 4 Voices, 4 Weeks, is a series of slideshows, all displayed on flat screen TVs And all of these TVs are facing outward. So they're in the glass wall windows of the Whitney, so you can see them from the street. Four Voices, 4 Weeks first premiered in Piccadilly Circus in London, and it was displayed on this huge monitor, this huge screen, and it draws together public statements by four very different figures. One, the punk icon Johnny Rotten, the queer theorist Judith Butler, the civil rights leader John Lewis, and then Elijah McClain, a 23-year-old Black man who was killed after being put in a chokehold by police in 2019. What's interesting about these various texts is that they're not exactly texts or even figures you would imagine associating with one another, but they create this kind of cacophony of public speech that go through questions of mourning, addressing history, being angry, seeking change, using rage as a motivator, but also deep personal reflection and self-sacrifice. The way that Coates displays these texts, and they're really found texts that he's appropriating and turning into slides, is to strip them of their proper grammar. So he pulls letters out. It's almost like tweets that we're seeing. And at first, they're really hard to read. But as they move, you start to get a sense of what the texts are actually saying to you. The slides themselves are animated in a way that feels like they're an advertisement. So they're kind of in the style of a bulletin board or a public LED screen that you might find in some place like Times Square or Piccadilly Circus. But the rhythm of them is actually based on music. A lot of Tony Coates' works draw on his own, whatever music he's listening to. In this case, it's Manic Street Preachers, the Knot Twist, Joy Division, and the Deadbeat. So it's all these different artists. Sometimes you can actually tune in and listen to the music, but the rhythm informs how these texts move. And Tony Coates has talked about watching these works is kind of like riding the subway while listening to music and reading, and that's the way we consume media today. Putting all these various media, color, text, song, into dialogue with one another, it's about both sharing the text on its own terms, what it's saying, but also using the media to kind of crack open the ideology that might be hidden in these texts. What I love about this work is that it's almost hard to make meaning out of it when you see the slides alone. But as you start to read them and the statements start to piece together and the rhythm starts to come together, you actually really start to keep up with what's being almost like spoken out loud to you. So there's this sense that you assimilate to the media, you get used to it. And it's not necessarily a comfortable feeling because suddenly it's like the media is telling you what rhythm to read these texts and how to interpret them. And that's all part of what Tony Coates is staging for us in these works. I think one of the most interesting things about Tony Coates's practice is that it's very much in relationship to the architecture of these spaces. 4 Voices, 4 Weeks is about militancy and mourning, particularly around anti-Black violence, and it faces out of the museum. So it's the first thing you see when you enter the Whitney. There are other pieces in the Whitney that are inside of the galleries and look out onto the city, including projects like Shrink, where what Tony Coates did is film New York City from a boat, like the Circle Line cruise from a distance, and then overlay it with texts that are about life in the city, whether it's police violence or homelessness. So there's this sense of the image of the city against its actual lived condition, while we actually see the city in the background as this paradigm of a kind of fantasy of what city life actually is. Now, in terms of playing with color and the use of text and meaning making, to get more grounded in a kind of traditional mode, we might look at the artist James Little, who's a Black abstract painter, really dedicated to what he says is Greenbergian formalism, stripping down painting to its material attributes of just flat surface, line, color, form, almost in a way that Tony Coates strips down these political speeches into just their text, simple color, and this slideshow that has this rhythmic quality. James Little's works are works that he's talked about being political from the outside. They're political from the edges in the ways that he titles them or brings references from the city or his experience of everyday life into his formal explorations. One of the great examples of that is his El Shabazz series, which is named after Malcolm X and was featured in this wonderful show that Kelly Jones did at the Walker Art Center in 1992 called Malcolm X, man ideal icon. So James Little talks about really being politicized with the assassination of Malcolm X, who incidentally, and I believe unrelatedly, was named at birth Malcolm Little. But Malcolm X as this figure that is signaled in the El Shabazz work by the black X that goes through what are otherwise just studies in the relationships between colors. You have 4 different triangles of color that are all put in relationship to one another, and they form this black X at the center. There's something really striking to think about the reference to Malcolm X, thinking about his role in the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and to think about then how these colors shift from a kind of flesh tone into the almost hi-fi, unnatural tone of a purple hue that you see in the top right panel over there. But the other thing that I love about this work is that it has these triangles that are actually really confronting one another, finding this apex. And if you stare at the center of the work, it almost looks like the X is being twisted or torqued, like it's being turned. There's just such formal mastery in James Little's works that there's always some dynamic element that won't stay still in his compositions. The works that are on view in the Whitney, and James Little is one of the artists who's featured on both the 5th and the 6th floor, have a similar play between the flat abstract properties of the painting and the sense that there might be more dynamic motion behind them. Private Storms is a great example of this. There's a background layer that's all splatter paint of greens and reds and yellows and whites. And I've given you a detailed image so you can see that background. And then on top of that is this grid of white squares. The grid of white squares is made with incredible precision, these perfect edges, but it's all handmade. So it's not made artificially that would make it a grid that was perfect. It has some irregularity to it. And the slight irregularity in the shapes of these squares means that the grid, when you're looking at it, starts to feel like it's undulating. Private Storms, as a title, refers to the idea of the kind of like private personal dramas. Private Storms is also the name of a film about like a domestic drama. But certainly as an artist, a Black artist in particular, I think there's one way we could look at Private Storms and think about James Little saying that the surface reading of this work has to get beyond this layer of the kind of white mesh to see all the multitude of singular paintings that are hiding behind it, that there's this multiplicity hidden inside this kind of overarching wash of whiteness that goes over the works. This becomes counterposed to the works that are on the 6th floor by James Little, which are part of a series of Black paintings. All of these paintings are done in Black. James Little is an incredible technician of paint, as well as a kind of masterful thinker about painting. And technically, he's so good at mixing paints. He uses a style of painting known as encaustic. If you join me for the Jasper Johns course, you'll know John's used encaustic as well. It's when you mix wax and other fixatives with pigment. So Little is using the same Black pigment here, but in different compositions of wax and fixative, he gets the wax to have a different sheen to it, a different quality, which is what gives you the different tonalities to Blackness here. These works, like Stars and Stripes, really speak to their meaning. Stars and Stripes is the middle painting here. There is a star there. There are also stripes, but of course it refers to the American flag. And one of the things James Little has said is that Malcolm X's assassination politicized him not only to make paintings about Black life, and in fact, not to do that at all, but to become a master of American modernism, to claim that as a territory in which he could assert some sort of space and ownership over the form of making painting. So there's something really kind of excellent about James Little's works. And then there's some questioning of this desire for excellence, especially in relationship to Black artists, when he makes paintings like Exceptional Blacks, which on one hand is about the exceptional quality of the Black paint that James Little has mixed. But if you reverse the words in that title, Black exceptionalism is something that's been written about much more broadly, about the racist imagining of, or kind of hyper consumption of stories about exceptional Black figures. The racism in that being this inherent assumption about a kind of inferiority, a racialized inferiority there. So there's this really powerful way in which the titles do a lot of work in bringing different readings to James Little's paintings. James Little is working in relationship to the world he lives in. It's very clear that he's not trying to revise the history of painting, but he is very much working with color as his subject matter. That's what he said. And many artists in American history have done that, especially the history of color field painters, artists like Helen Frankenthaler, who used to pour paint directly onto a canvas and allow the paint to stain the canvas. So wherever the paint went was what the final composition would be. And those painters really had a home at Bennington College, which is where Matt Connors, the painter you see here, actually studied. And Matt Connors' work is sort of taking up that legacy of color field painting. Connors' works are about taking up that legacy of color field painting and making paintings that are uncertain and ambiguous. You know, they're anxious paintings. They don't really know how to resolve themselves. They ask us questions about how do paintings do things and how do they communicate with us. One way that they do this is that they're very process oriented. If you look closely at Matt Connors' work, you can see that there's a lot of translucency in his paint. So you can see what layer came first and what layer came second. So there's this sense of history that you know how the work was made. And at the same time, there's this sort of ambivalence between the way that lines and shapes align with one another, that they never really cohere into a final composition, nor do they dissolve into a sequence of fragments. They're somewhere in between actually being a form and totally atomizing out of their formlessness, into formlessness. So Body Forth, which is a title that suggests this idea of giving form to something, it's a great title for this work. It doesn't really know how to resolve itself. And Connors says that he's really interested in making paintings that stay in that ambiguity because his favorite experience is the humbling of coming around to seeing something that he originally didn't understand or even dislike. And I just think that the invitation to be sort of confused by these paintings is an interesting gesture to include in the show, especially when we look at more politicized works, we could say, to have that open-ended exploration of how is art doing the work of bringing things to our attention and raising awareness, but also how does art stand on its own 2 feet in relationship to the histories that artists might be working towards. And that is really beautifully, I think, thought through very carefully in the works of Dwayne Linklater, who's a Moose Cree First Nations artist, whose works are also thinking about the history of color field painting, but certainly thinking about Cree traditions and Cree practices as well. This is a work titled from a series that Linklater has titled Winter Count. The title actually comes from the idea that in Cree, you don't ask someone how old they are, you ask them how many winters they are. So there's this sense of aging, but also survival. How many winters have you survived? These works, which we see hanging in the foreground here by Linklater, are paintings on one hand. They're absolutely canvases that have been stained, often stained with materials that come out of Cree traditional cultural practices like cochineal or orange pekoe tea. But they're also sculptures. They hang in the viewer's space. They're not aligned with the wall. They have a 3-dimensionality, a kind of bodily form to them. And there's this interesting way that Linklater doesn't resolve whether these are Cree paintings or colored field paintings, but they're both at the same time. That's very intentional, certainly because one of the things that Linklater is doing is resisting the idea that what he's going to give us is an authentic, immediate kind of easy access to an idea of what Indigenous art is. In fact, what he's making is something that draws more on the aesthetics of minimalism. There's a distancing, a safekeeping there in the way he draws Cree practice into making something that really does look like abstract painting. What I think is beautiful about that gesture is that it's also realized on the kind of material or surface support, we could say, that Linklater uses. All of these are non-functional TP structures. So they're not actual TPs, but they're canvases or fabrics or supports that are sewn together in the shape that a TP covering would actually be formed. Now, the TP itself is such a kind of stereotypical mode of representing native life. And of course, it's not an architecture that one finds across all tribes. It is specific to Cree communities. But the thing that Linklater really highlights about the TP is that it's a flexible architecture. It's meant to be installed in whatever environment and to provide shelter and safekeeping. So there's this way in which the TP, as a kind of flexible architecture, is setting up its own space inside of the institutional space of the Whitney's Museum here. What's also great about this is that these are disassembled teepees. They're not actually formed in the teepee shape. So there's this sense that as much as they are kind of playing with creating their own space, they're at the verge of becoming like artifacts in the kind of violent history of the way Native cultures and life have actually been displayed as artifacts in museums for far too long. So there's this push and pull about how we're supposed to read the utopian or dystopian quality of these pieces. The last thing that I want to say about these works is that it's not only that Dwayne Linklater uses Korean materials, but he uses really contemporary materials as well. Materials that refer to temporary shelters, flexible architectures like the plastic tarp, which is the blue material you see in the top left there. And he uses that as much to conjure other kind of architectural forms that provide temporary shelter as he does to kind of incorporate marks and gestures on the works themselves. You can see all the markings, the black markings on this particular piece from Winter Count. Even that has this triangular form, but as it shrinks in size, it creates this illusion of perspective, of depth going into the space. So there really is playing with the viewer's vision and expectations here. And all of that really comes to fruition with the fact that what Linklater does is he also comes in and moves these pieces around, or has instructions for how they should be moved around. So they're not static objects. They'll be reshaped and reformed throughout the course of the biennial. And in fact, there's a number of artists in the show whose work is actually being dynamically shifted at various points. So there's no one way to look at these pieces. And lastly, on this theme of color, I just wanted to highlight this wonderful work by Ito Barada called A Day is a Day, which is has two components to it, one of which is this dual projection of 16 millimeter film. I don't have a great installation image of this, but it's two 16 millimeter projectors in the gallery, and they're running this raw footage filmed at two weather acceleration facilities, one in Miami and Phoenix. Weather acceleration facilities are facilities that recreate real world weather conditions over a condensed time frame in order to test various materials, plastics, car surfaces, to see how they weather. So to try and suggest a kind of test for their durability. And in this way, you'll often have a control object. So what you're seeing here are these panels of sheet metal that have all been colored with different paint, and the weather acceleration facility would be testing how that paint stands up to weather, like sunlight or rainstorms or salt. And you'll have a control, one object that stays the same and one object that's put through these weather accelerators. And with the films, you hear the scientists talking about how they look for the breakdown in color, the cracking in the surfaces, the kind of the subtle shift that marks some sort of wear or weathering in these pieces. And of course, their goal is to resist weathering, to resist any sort of markings that occur as these objects are subjected to natural environments, intensified over time. But there's something about Ito Barada's work that's really about embracing that kind of weathering and marking. One of her earlier pieces, Family Tree from 2005, is this beautiful work in which she's at her mother's home and has taken all of the family photos off of the wall. And what's left is this marking on the wall where the wall around these photos was bleached progressively over time by the sun. And what Ito Barada has done is photograph that wall in the absence of these family images, but with the markings that remain in their place. So there's this sense of both the longing for memory, but also the loss of it as well. And that's something I think that you really get a sense of when you're watching A Day is a Day, as a way of thinking about these control objects, two pieces that start out the same, and then one is really put through the ringer of a kind of climate crisis in a way. And its weathering is then cast out or thrown away. If it degrades too quickly, it's seen as not durable enough to survive in the natural world, and how we might read that as a metaphor for the broader landscape of how we're all experiencing climate and the environment and the kind of violence and destruction of it in very different ways. Now, the other aspect I mentioned at the top of talking was this idea of line and form, and many of the artists who are working through abstraction use line and shape and form in really dynamic ways to think about really complex histories. Denise Tommaso's work greets you right when you enter the 6th floor gallery, and Tommaso's is working here with 3 structural sites, architectural sites, that have been used to contain slaves: ships, prisons, and mass burial sites. What you're looking at here is a work called Jail. And here, Tommaso is actually looking at prisons, mass incarceration facilities, historical prisons, and then she creates these abstract paintings that are all done with cross-hatching, perpendicular lines of white and black layered on top of one another. And what Tommaso said she was interested in doing when she created these works in the 90s was really creating a work that gave the viewer the sense of confinement and containment, the sense of having nowhere to go and nowhere to breathe. And as a Black artist, it was very much for her about using sites that are marked with psychic violence and material and physical violence against the Black body, and to try and use abstraction as a way of playing with those, or not playing with those, but kind of reimagining those, we could say. And I think it's really powerful to say that what Tommaso is doing is not looking back at the history of the jail or a particular jail site, but trying to conjure the experience of being confined or contained for the viewer in the present moment, as maybe a way of saying that these sites of violence aren't historical, that they live on, they're ongoing in the present, and to bring them kind of into the space of the gallery. This is certainly true if you look at the next work by Tommaso's, which is across this entryway here on the 6th floor. And these are the two pieces of Tommaso's that we have on view. It's called Displaced Burial, and it's largely based around the structures and architecture of Gorée Island, which is an island off the coast of Senegal, an embarkation point for the slave trade, that has huge mansions for traders where they would live, and then small confined spaces where those who were enslaved were being kept. And that play between open expanses and confined tight spaces is really evidenced in the kind of ways that Tommaso's creates space and asks the viewer to inhabit those spaces in these works. Tommaso's works are on the 6th floor, right as you get off the elevators. Just below that, on the 5th floor, as you get off the elevators, are the work by Ellen Gallagher. And these are two works that have really interesting dialogue with one another, because Ellen Gallagher's works are also looking at the legacy of the transatlantic slaves trade, thinking about renderings and representations of the Black body, and the way in which she might draw on that history to develop her own kind of language or lexicon in painting. So Ellen Gallagher is probably better known for works like Deluxe, where she took pages from Black magazines like Ebony and Sepia, and would create these forms over elements like wigs or hairdos that were being sold, and then spatializes these so that you get to see the repeated patterns, but also so you get to see Ellen Gallagher extracting abstract objects or shapes based on representations of the Black body that then fold into later compositions of hers. In the works that are on view at the Biennial, Gallagher, which are called Ecstatic Drought of Fishes, Gallagher has talked about having several different references. Some of them are art historical, and some of them actually refer to the many meanings of the word draft, excuse me, not drought, draft, which is spelled in the British style in the title. So on one hand, you have Peter Paul Rubens' The Miraculous Draught of Fishes, which is a painting about Christ conjuring fishes and preaching from this boat. And you have all of these disciples of Christ drafting or pulling, as the word might mean, fishes from the ocean. Then you have Jarek Halt's The Raft of the Medusa, a very famous work of art, which here brings up the idea of draft, meaning the kind of amount of water a boat needs to float in. The Raft of the Medusa is about a ship that moored itself and shipwrecked off the coast of Mauritania. It was a French naval ship, and almost everybody on the ship died. And Jarek Halt's painting of this was really seen as a kind of liberal statement to the violence of the colonial pursuit. And then lastly is this work by J.M.W. Turner called Slave Ship, which is an attempt to create a historical painting about a story, an actual event of a slave ship in which sick and dying slaves were thrown off of the ship unceremoniously to their death in the sea, so that the ship's captain could claim the insurance on these particular slaves. And as you can see in Turner's work, there's no clear rendering of this. There's a sense of the kind of violent movement of the ocean, the sublime quality of nature, but you can see these kind of fragments of the visceral quality of the sea, but it's not nearly as realistic as Jarek Halt's work. And in that sense, it might be about drafting in the sense of just sketching, not even being able to imagine this kind of deep, resonant, and literally uncountable violence. movements. And all of these are precursors to the ways in which Ellen Gallagher is drawing color and form and shape into the work she's done that are included in the Whitney Biennial. Now, if we just go forward to the work that are actually in the biennial, ecstatic draft of fishes, what you'll see here are these figures that are done in palladium leaf. So they're vibrantly silver. They're futuristic, but they also have this sort of almost kind of historic or even like ancient sculptural form to them. So they're sort of out of time. And Gallagher has talked about these works having a reference to this idea of Black Atlantis, the idea of creating a mythology around the lost Isle of Atlantis that's particularly made up of all of the slaves who died at sea in the transatlantic slave trade, and perhaps the fantasy, the imagining that they've created an underworld where there's a space you can breathe underwater, having escaped the violence of slavery and the violence of anti-Black violence that has come in its wake. But all of this is done on top of patterns and forms that Gallagher has pulled from studies of oceans and amoebas and different shapes, and then layered on what looks like textiles or almost like a tapestry with these rectangular forms. What those are actually pieces of penmanship paper, which is Gallagher's preferred surface to work on. And penmanship paper here that's been treated or dyed with various materials, but penmanship paper is the blue line paper that kids often get in grade school to practice their letters. So you really get that sense that Gallagher is creating her own alphabet here, her own language. Out of this history, how do we make something different with it? And that idea of looking at history and thinking what we can make with it is resonant with the work of Rick Lowe, which is right behind Ellen Gallagher's on the 5th floor. Rick Lowe is an artist who some of you might know better from his Project Row House, where in 1993, Rick got together with a number of artists and bought 20 row houses in Houston's 3rd Ward and transformed these houses into a community center, a space for art, really as a way of trying to have art have a direct social impact and to work against the way in which art has often been utilized in strategies of gentrification and renewal that have displaced particularly Black and brown communities. And this is an ongoing project, but it's really a community-focused project that doesn't leave a lot of space for Rick, who's trained as a landscape painter, to have studio practice. So the paintings that are on, the painting that is on view at the Whitney Biennial, which is called Project Row Houses, If Artists Are Creatives, Why Can't They Create Solutions, brings Project Row House into the conversation through the title. But it's actually a kind of painting Lowe has been engaged in recent years in his studio that are all based on another one of his practices, which is he's a devout dominoes player. And he plays dominoes with a number of different friends and community members at Project Row House, as well as elsewhere. And at some point, Rick started to photograph the dominoes boards as they were being laid out. So the painting you're looking at here is based on these photographs of dominoes boards. Lowe uses them as a reference. He doesn't copy them exactly. And then sometimes what he'll do is even take the painting, let it dry, and then cut it up and collage it back on to these painted surfaces themselves. So it's almost like he uses his own paintings as domino tiles. And they really do start to look like the most chaotic mapping of the city. As an artist who's been for a long time engaged in how art can resist forms of urban planning that use art towards gentrification, there's an interesting way in which dominoes become the way he's figuring a map of the city. Because the domino game means that Rick Lowe isn't the one creating this composition as an autonomous or authoritative figure, but it's a composition that comes out of the social engagement, the playfulness of the interaction of dominoes, the attempt of laying down tiles in dialogue with someone else. And then there's this impossibility of really finding our way through this map, which I think, and Rick spoke beautifully about this during the walkthrough, might have something to do with the sense that what he's trying to think about, how art can have socially positive impact in the world, is unmappable. It's a project that one has to engage in without really knowing how the form will result in the end of the day. So there's this sense of impossibility in these works as well. And the idea that what Rick Lowe is working with is the questions of patterns and forms and maps and how to think about how we map out the world around us and how that can be reflected in a more socially engaged way in painting might be a way to connect to the work of Diani Whitehawk, who's really thinking about patterns, where patterns come from and where certain aesthetics come from as well. This is Diani Whitehawk's Wopilla Lineage from 2021. It's a commission for the Whitney Biennial, and it's a work that at first glance really looks like hard-edged geometric abstraction. You could compare this to any number of painters, including artists like Barnett Newman, who have a number of paintings with these triangles in them. Whitehawk is playing with the balance of color. You have these perfect triangular forms inside of them, or diamond shapes with a black up top and white on the bottom, if you read it that way. But what's interesting to note is that this is a painting, and Whitehawk does talk about this as a painting, made up entirely of hand-sewn glass bugle beads. I believe there's a close-up image of these glass beads. So what Whitehawk is doing here in thinking about this as a lineage painting is, on the one hand, bringing in the kind of contemporary art viewer's expectation of seeing this kind of abstract geometric painting, and Whitehawk trained as a painter, but pulling in her own Lakota heritage of beadwork and using a particular Lakota pattern. So she's putting these patterns in dialogue and thinking about what is the lineage of these patterns? You know, where do the geometric abstractionists actually get their idea of just turning to simple geometric patterning? Is there a way in which that's drawing on a form of cultural appropriation? But more than just simply indicting that form of cultural appropriation or theft of indigenous culture, there's a way the materials that Whitehawk is using speak to an even more complex sense of intercultural zones of contact. The glass beads that Whitehawk uses, though we today might traditionally associate them with Lakota beadwork, are actually beads that only enter that beadwork through exchange with European settlers. It's the European settlers who bring the glass beads to the New World. And so there's this sense that the beads themselves already speak to the way in which culture has this more porous relationship. It isn't simply about theft or appropriation, but there's a way about stealing and working against and in relationship to the kind of exchanges that are ongoing in the present moment. That sense of exchange and ongoing dialogue about how we think about zones of contact, how we kind of push against the borders that exist all around us, literally and metaphorically, is one way we might turn to a few works to end today's session. And that's the work of Lisa Alvarado. Lisa Alvarado is an artist whose paintings have this really vibrant quality to them. They hang out in the physical space of the viewer, so they're almost like tapestries in a way. They have a patterning that calls to you. They're hard to miss. They're so bright. And then when you get up close, the detail is really exquisite in them. They look like natural forms. They have this quality of undulating waves or gusts of wind. It's interesting to note that these are works from a series called Vibratory Cartography, Napantla, and Napantla is the Nahuatl, which is a pre-Hispanic or Mesoamerican language. It's the Nahuatl word for in-between or in-betweenness. And certainly there's this sense that the patterns that Alvarado is using have this almost kind of Mesoamerican quality to them, as well as being something like maps. And you could think about them as maps of the kind of border zones, particularly the southern border of the United States. But what's really interesting about these works is that there's no direct reference for Alvarado's works. In fact, they're something like paintings, but they're also something like artifacts or objects that have absorbed a sort of interaction of the artist as she's exploring the shapes and the colors that go on them, but also in the way she uses these paintings. These are paintings that she uses as backdrops for her jazz drone band, the Natural Information Society. And it's Alvarado's partner who's the kind of front of the band, and his studio is right next to hers. And she talks about he's often rehearsing his music while she's painting, and how is it that the music actually filters into the work? So the sense that it's not only about the kind of US-Mexico border, as we might think about associating these works, but also the borders and boundaries between disciplines and artistic forms, as well as the collaboration between artists. In this way, as a precedent, Alvarado has cited artists like Don and Mochi Cherry. And Don and Mochi Cherry were partners, and Don was a jazz musician and Mochi Cherry is a painter, and Mochi Cherry made these amazing kind of psychedelic paintings, and Don would perform inside of them, and really had this utopian idea that what they were creating was not only an art form, but a new world, a kind of new utopia. And I love the idea that Alvarado's paintings are sort of gesturing to that idea that if they could just stop being treated like paintings and really become the kind of environment in which we get immersed, they have that really utopian and aspiration in them. And that sense that they also bring in this question of how performance and performativity factors into the works is certainly a dynamic we see throughout this year's biennial. And this is the last artist I'll talk about for today. It's a great note to end on because next week we'll look at questions of the body and performance, but it's the work of Awilda Sterling-Dupreeh, who's a very well-known Puerto Rican movement artist, choreographer, dancer, but really trained as a painter. These are paintings on view in the gallery by Awilda, and they're works in which, as the artist herself has said, the composition comes last, because the composition is actually a result of a performance that Awilda did during the installation of the biennial. It's a performance called Blindfolded, where Awilda actually blindfolds herself, listens to music, and then performs in relationship to the materials and textures and all sorts of senses except for vision, the one sense we most often associate with painting. Now, Awilda is really an improvisation artist. I mean, her improvisation is her medium, but she's deeply trained as an experimental dancer. She's trained in Afro-Caribbean dance styles. She'll lead classes that'll teach you, Yoruba dance performances, but then encourages students to experiment with how those performances live in their bodies. Because as she said, her body is her medium. It contains all of the kind of knowledge and experience of art in the world. And so it's really as a vessel that her body communicates these markings that turn into these compositions that reside in the gallery. It's a performance for no one to view in its liveness, but it's the remnants, what comes after and what continues to resonate that we get to see. I have a hard time not associating this work with a very famous work of art that's not in the Whitney's biennial by Carolee Schneemann called Up to and Including Her Limits, another feminist artist who really was a painter, but was often treated as a performance artist. Schneemann here puts herself in a tree harness used for trimming trees high up and swings around the corner of this room where she makes this gestural painting literally at the limits of her physical material body, maybe thinking about the limits of her embodied flesh, the limits of the female body as we can think about it as a kind of vehicle for the abstract expressionism that is so dominated by male artists. But what's interesting about that comparison to Awilda's work is that for Awilda, it's not that her body is self-contained and its limits are the thing that are being expressed here. Her body is really a vehicle, as she talks about, to open up to the multitudes of selves, traditions, genealogies that reside inside her. And dance is the conduit that she uses to kind of enact that. And the compositions that result from that, although they may seem like they lack criticality, are in fact maybe things that we have to continue to explore, like how is there meaning here that we're not yet able to translate? And I say lack criticality because that is a title Awilda has actually given to one of her performances, because she's very aware of how the viewer might perceive this sensory act, but it's the commitment to the way in which what she senses and feels might have deeper meaning in it that I think is what brings her work in concert with other artists in the biennial. So I see there are two questions in the Q&A. And I want to just take a minute to see if there are any more that come in. But the first question was there a philosophy of the curators about their selection of individual artists beyond your comment of retrospection and looking back? And if so, what is it? I don't think the curators had a philosophy in their selection. We might talk about a philosophical model of curating, which is to say that the curators are resisting themes, and that is definitely a kind of approach, a curatorial approach, to say that themes have often been a way that curators have kind of imported meaning onto works of art and refused to allow the work of art to create their own meaning. So there's this sense that the curators have really resisted creating meaning. In that sense, if you're really looking at theory and philosophy, it's the post-colonial idea of dismantling authority and dismantling the singular voice that we'll see as we move through the course is very resonant in the way the curators have worked and the artists that they've brought in. Trinity Minha, who's an artist in the show, is a great example of that, not only as an exceptional filmmaker, but as an incredible theorist and philosopher as well. So there are artists actually who are their own philosophers in the show, and you could look to them as examples. Any resonance between works that have surprised me? That's a great question. I think this might have been a question, Jorge, that you asked last time that I did the virtual tour. There are a number of really great resonance between works. There are hidden meanings and associations that one can draw, especially as artists move between different floors. I mentioned that I think the Ellen Gallagher and the Denise Tommaso is really kind of a brilliant pairing of works as you enter both of these spaces. And as Andy Hawks, who is here actually running the course, mentioned to me, like, even to think about how Gorée Island, which is being represented in the painting here, has this moment where you would step off into the ledge of the ocean, and that then down below, literally on the 5th floor, is Ellen Gallagher's work, which is thinking about the bottom of the ocean where this mythology of Black Atlantis would live. It's a beautiful kind of association between those. So that's one pairing I might offer to you. Could I repeat the title of the first piece by Denise Tommaso? It's the first title of the piece by Denise Tommaso is Jail. This is Jail. Jail is, sorry, this doesn't have a title on it. This is Jail, and Jail is paired with this work called Displaced Burial, Burial at Gorée. This was actually a project that Tommaso's conceived as a triptych. So there is a third painting in the series, but it is not on view in the biennial. Might the formal aspect of James Little's works be fruitfully discussed in relationship to some of Jacqueline Humphrey's works? Absolutely. You know, I think that's exactly the provocation that I was trying to make. You have someone like Matt Connors, who's a very contemporary painter and has often been associated with artists like Jacqueline Humphreys and her exploration of how paintings are constructed and literally like the formal meanings of paintings, but that's very much in James Little's works. I will say that Little has been very insistent that his works are not trying to be in relationship only to the field of painting. He says that he gets inspiration from his paintings by walking through the city and seeing signage or fragments of statements or phrases. And it really is mastering the kind of modernist principle of the autonomous artists having their own ideas that he's invested in here. But certainly there is a resonance there. And I think if you look at James Little's work across time, there's a real shift in the way he moved. I mean, these works are so flat in a way from 1985, from the El Shabazz series. There's much more dynamism in the works that are more recent. You get this sense of motion and movement, which is very much like the kind of work that's being associated with Jacqueline Humphreys here. Might the last two artists discussed today be fruitfully discussed in relationship to the contemporary paintings of Jenny C. Jones? And I think that's a great example of how Jenny C. Jones, whose work I believe is still on view at the Guggenheim, brings questions of sound and the elements of the performance of space into the works, whereas Awilda literally is bringing performance into those works. And where do those kind of aspects or ideas about performance and performativity meet? Is a really great question. What was the process for commissioning works for the biennial? That's a great question. You know, I think it really depends on the artist's practice. One thing I didn't say about Diani Whitehawk's work, and the reason I called this a commission, if I can just get back to it, is that one of the things that Whitehawk has talked about with making these kinds of paintings, which are beads, and she does do paintings of beads, which go much quicker, are much easier to paint beads rather than to paint with beads, is that these take a long time. They're incredibly laborious works. I have a process image here where you can see how she does it. She sews together or weaves together these strips of beads and then sews them onto the canvas. But this is the largest work to date that Diani Whitehawk has made. And part of that is because the commission from the Whitney allowed her to make a work at this scale, which means that the more an institution is willing to invest in Diani Whitehawk's work, the larger she can invest in exploring the interaction between contemporary art and indigenous practice, which is a big part of her work. So there's a sort of political commitment on the part of the Whitney to really pay to commission the work. So that's one way that commissioning would work. I mean, it's very intrinsic to a practice like Whitehawk's. Other artists, certainly, some have ideas about works they want to do, they propose it. Others just want to include works from their past. Well, as we see with Renee Green, she's included a work from 1989 because she wanted to look back on her work. So the commissioning, I think, is really very much in dialogue between the curators and the artists. How many of the works are specifically created for the biennial after the artist is selected? It's hard to say how many of these works are actually specifically created for the biennial. I could do a count for you of the most recent works for next week, but a lot of these works seem to have a real quality of being very much made during the last 3 years, which is to say during the COVID era. And as we'll see as we go forward, this is the most abstract day, I would say, but there's a lot of artists who are looking at how our lives have been mediated through screens, how retrospection is not only a quality of looking back historically, but having space and time to reflect, and also the space and time to need to mourn and to grieve, and how there's no real resolve in this moment. So the works in the show can't have that resolve, going back to this idea of the open-ended parentheses, but that they might open up a space for us to continue to ask questions about what works of art might do in the kind of frayed or fried ends that we're all living in now as we emerge at different degrees and in different ways from the last 3 years and are still living through the pandemic. So we'll see how that's reflected next week when we turn to this question of figuration, and artists are really looking at bodies in sickness, post-humanist bodies, cyborg bodies, but also are trying to figure big questions, give shape and form to different notions or concepts or themes or urgent questions in the world. And then the last week where we really look at how artists are taking up history and complicating the kind of linear trajectory to really fold history into the present. But tonight, I think we have to end. So I want to thank you all for the first version of the course, first step of the course, and I hope you get a chance to come back next week and join us then. Thank you all, and I will see you next Thursday.